Fantasy Animation is a completely free, online, educational resource dedicated to examining the relationship between fantasy storytelling and the medium of animation. It is staffed by a volunteer army of academics and animators who give up their time to run the website so that our audience can be kept informed not just about the latest goings-on in the world of all things that are drawn, imagined and sculpted, but to help inform them about the historical, political, ethical and aesthetic ramifications of what it means to make an animated fantasy. Check out our weekly blog posts containing insights on everything from the sexual identity of SpongeBob SquarePants to how to make an animation on a pair of knickers. You can also access our archive of podcasts featuring Oscar-winning VFX supervisors, historians, classicists, animators and folklorists discussing their favourite examples of fantasy animation. To find out more, visit us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram and Reddit at FanAnimResearch, FANANIM Research, or visit fantasy-animation.org. I hope you enjoy the show. Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast. I am, in this form and many others, Alex Sargent.
And I am the metamorphic Chris Holliday.
Metamorphosis, the key word of the podcast, might have been struck already.
Yep.
Chris, today we're talking about Howl's Moving Castle, another effort from the problematically named Studio Ghibli, whatever else we're calling it today. Let's call the whole thing off. Another adventure back into the world of Miyazaki. What can animation fans look forward to in this episode?
Well, I was saying to you just before we came to record that I was convinced I'd seen it, but it turns out I haven't. But actually, this might be my favourite of the Ghibli ones we've done so far. So I've got a little bit on sort of CGI, synthesis between the CGI and cell animation, kind of historical, I think, representations within animation of the home and the home space and the kind of metamorphic qualities of the home space, and also flying. Why Ghibli as a studio have often been sort of connected to images of flight. The skies of Ghibli are filled with all kinds of things, and certainly this film is no exception. So yeah, I've got a few little nuggets to say. I'm guessing this is a fantasy in some way, Alex.
Yep, it is. Luckily, I don't have to do the heavy lifting on that this week because our guests can do that for me. But yeah, absolutely, it's a classic fantasy tale told by one of our premier animated fantasists, an adaptation of an equally important fantasist who we will come to talk about, I'm sure, in just a second. But let's introduce our guest. We are absolutely thrilled on the podcast this week to welcome Professor Brian Attebery, who is Professor of English at Idaho State University. He's also the editor of the Journal of the Fantastic in the Arts. Brian is a guest who, for many, will need no introduction, and I'm not going to be able to do him justice by giving him one, so I'll keep it short. He's the author of a number of really important works of scholarship, digesting the literary fantastic. Strategies of Fantasy is such an important text that listeners will already be bored of me citing it, but not bored of Brian engaging with it, I'm sure. But he's also the author of a number of important things. The fantasy tradition in American literature, from Irving to Le Guin, a really important book. A more recent work entitled Stories About Stories, Fantasy and the Remaking of Myth. And he teases us that he has a new book called Fantasy in the World that is due out in the summer, which will be published by Oxford University Press. And we're going to talk more about that as the podcast rolls on. But for now, Brian, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you.
And thanks for picking such a wonderful movie for us to talk about this week, Howl's Moving Castle. What inspired this choice, and what do you fancy talking about this week?
Well, I could answer by saying I've been a Miyazaki fan since I first saw My Neighbor Totoro, and I am a huge Diana Wynne Jones fan, not only for her fiction, but her very clever parody of fan cultures in The Tough Guide to Fantasyland. And so the convergence of those two things would make this an interest. I actually will start by mentioning something outside of this, which is that I was able to work with Ursula Le Guin on a number of projects and became friends with her. And so over the years, we conversed a little bit about film adaptations. And I know that she was very much aware of this movie, Howl's Moving Castle, and was aware that Diana Wynne Jones was pretty satisfied with the film, even though it departs in many ways from her book. And that is what persuaded Le Guin to accept an offer to film A Wizard of Earthsea. And then she felt like she had been sort of bait and switched when it was not Hayao Miyazaki, but Goro Miyazaki, who made the movie and somehow turned it into a completely different story about father-son rivalries. I can't imagine why that would be.
Well, now I want to make the podcast about that, but we shan't. You mentioned the novelist in question, who this is an adaptation of, Diana Wynne Jones. I was saying before we started recording, but I repeat for the listeners' sake, I reckon this is an author that 80% of our listenership will be very familiar with, and 20% might not have heard of, but she's an incredibly important and interesting figure in the history of fantasy literature, and I don't think she's one that's come up on the podcast before. So do you want just giving us a sort of, I don't know, Wikipedia style summary of who Diana Wynne Jones is and what the story of Howl's Moving Castle is before we get to the film itself?
All right. Well, it's really hard to sum up Diana Wynne Jones because she wrote dozens of books in pretty much every mode of the fantastic, for adults, for children. Her work is always complicated and funny. And she once wrote that the difference between writing for children and writing for adults is that children pay attention, so you don't have to explain as much. But she liked to build in sort of complicated structures of reality into her work, so that you think you've penetrated to this is what's really going on, and then you discover, nope, not yet, not there yet. And Howl's Moving Castle is not as sort of folded in upon itself as something like Fire and Hemlock, which is, those two works are probably the two that are most people's favorites who are Diana Wynne Jones fans. Howl's Moving Castle, just a brief summary of it. It starts out sounding sort of traditional fairy tale. It has a land called Ingary and a character named Sophie, who is not the youngest, but the oldest of three sisters. And because she knows her fairy tale lore, she knows that means she will never succeed, because it's always the youngest of the three who is the successful prince or maiden in the tale. So she sort of resigned herself to being of service to other people. She works in a hat shop that was originally owned by her parents. And as we meet her at the beginning of the book, she is sort of hiding out and making hats and talking to them. She ventures outside, meets a wizard named Howl, who has a bad reputation for being a heartless seducer of young women. The heartless turns out to be literal and part of the plot of the story. But they hit it off pretty well. Sophie then encounters another magic maker, the Witch of the Waste, which is a joke on L. Frank Baum and the Wicked Witch of the West, I think. The Witch of the Waste puts a spell on Sophie because she sees her as a dangerous rival, and transforms her from a young, rather meek young woman into an old woman, creaking along. And this turns out to be tremendously liberating for Sophie, because as an old woman, she's free to speak her mind. She doesn't have to take care of everybody. And that's part of the point of the story, is that this releases sort of the inner Sophie. She goes out of town because she can't stay where she is in her old woman guise, comes across Howl's moving castle of the title, which is literally that. It's a structure that moves around the countryside, and there's even more to it than that, and sort of invites herself in as a cleaning lady or guest. And from then on, she kind of transforms both the castle and Howl himself in very positive ways. And I don't want to go through all of the plot, but those are sort of the central issues in it.
From what you say, it seems like this film is a relatively close adaptation. You're describing the novel, but could be describing the film. But I just before, because I found it quite difficult to pin down the film, which I think fits perfectly in terms of what it's doing and the instability of its worlds and identity and flux and all that sort of stuff. And this is where I am hopefully throwing my very cursory fantasy knowledge into the ring. I think one of the reasons I found it difficult to pin down, so I'd be interested in both of your sort of views on where to place it, because I think, like animation, fantasy is often wrought with definitions, and we went back, going back to the beginning of the podcast, we've talked a lot about what kind of fantasy is this, what sort of animation are we dealing with here. And I think one of the reasons I found the film kind of quite tricky to navigate, despite the relatively straightforward plot in lots and lots of ways, I found it difficult because it seemed to be a combination of a sort of, I guess, an immersive fantasy where magic and fantasy is accepted as part of the world, which I suppose runs the risk of making it too taken for granted. Whereas there are elements, certainly towards the end of the film, and I'm not sure whether this is true of the book per se, that it leans more towards a sort of portal quest in a way that preserves an element of amazement and discovery within a world where fantasy is accepted. And so I just wondered whether or not, or what, where does this? What sort of fantasy is Howl's Moving Castle? Given that I'm certainly not the fantasy person in the room, I would just be really interested in kind of trying to pin down something that seems perfect for Miyazaki and Ghibli to adapt, and also to adapt so closely, given the way that you described it. I would be interested to know what sort of fantasy or label are we kind of conferring onto this film, given the rhetorics of fantasy.
Mm-hmm. Well, in my description, I kind of stopped short of the places where it diverges.
Right.
The film diverges from the book, and that's partly because I didn't want to get into too much of a comparison, because I don't think that's the most interesting thing to say about the movie.
Yeah.
But I will say that the book is Sophie's story, with Howl as a supporting character. The movie is definitely Howl's story. I like both book and movie. Mm-hmm. I did find that the loss of the kind of feminist message disappointed me a lot, but I appreciated the anti-war themes that is entirely Miyazaki's addition. It's not there in the book. And I think, as I was trying to think through this and how to talk about both of them, and in terms of what fantasy can do, I came back to an idea that I've been playing with, and it's in this forthcoming book on fantasy, and that is that fantasy has several ways of telling truths, even though it is overtly a lie, a made-up thing. If you read fantasy looking for fidelity to the world, you're reading it wrong. But once you get past that sort of disclaimer of any kind of truthful reporting, then fantasy has all these ways of either representing or even constructing truthful messages. And it can do it metaphorically, and there's a lot of that in fantasy and in these two fantasies, book and movie. But it can also do it structurally, and that's an idea that I've been trying to figure out for myself what I mean by that. But basically, it's fantasy sets things out in very kind of almost mapped out ways, so that, let's take something going way off track from this movie. Edgar Allan Poe and The Fall of the House of Usher. The house is both a physical structure and a family, which is a common use of that term. The house is both the Usher people and the Usher place. But it's also, as we read through this story, the house represents the kind of crumbling psyche of Roderick Usher, and eventually we discover his mad sister, who are themselves really kind of one person. So we've got a house that's a person or a family. We've got a brother and a sister who are one person. These are very fantasy ways of representing things that can go on in real psyches, real sort of disturbed individuals, or even just everybody when we confront difficult kinds of situations. So that's a structural way of representing what's inside and imperceptible and hidden in a very clear sort of externalized form. And Poe is one of those who does that. George MacDonald is another one who does it. And both of them before Freud. And that's, I think, kind of important because we can't just translate what they are doing into, oh, that's the id, the superego, and the what I leave out, the id, the ego, and the superego, yeah. Or in a different period of Freud, the conscious, the unconscious. It is, but it isn't, because these are pre-Freudian and they're finding their own ways of representing inner forces and inner processes by, as I say, externalizing them and giving them visible structures. And structure as in house, but also structure as in mapped out space or distributed characters. So Roderick and Madeline Usher are one person divided into two. Ursula Le Guin analyzes Tolkien. She says one of the great things about The Lord of the Rings is you've got Gollum and Smeagol, who are two characters in one body, and Sam and Frodo, and all four of them together are one sort of entity, divided into contrary impulses and sort of different personality types, and yet altogether create a character as complex as any found in realistic fiction, but distributed. Okay, so that's my notion of how structures function in fantasy, is that they allow us to see things about the way we are, the way we function in the world, the way we are put together. Maybe another film reference that people might be familiar with is Inside Out, the Pixar movie, which does the same sort of thing. It puts many people inside the head of one individual. So there are characters that are distributed among different bodies, but there are also compounded characters.
So that's absolutely fascinating what you're saying. I think to try and unpack it for listeners, and then we can go back into right. The film. But that such is the luxury of podcasting that we can take a little turn left here. Is that part of the, because I don't know who the quote comes from. It could even be yourself, Brian, but I can't remember off the top of my head. Is that the kind of the extra fictional quality of fantasy storytelling, in that it's almost a story on top of a story, or it announces the process of construction in a way that mimetic fiction attempts to suppress or denounce or hide or make invisible. That to tell not just to tell a story, because a Freudian would argue that kind of part of the process of telling stories is in a way a kind of act of therapy, isn't it? It's putting us in the protagonist of a cause and event chain. But the fact of taking a fantasy story provides us not only with a sort of a metaphorical vocabulary to speak about ourselves, but actually a way of almost to use your analogy, building a house by which we can put different neuroses, different ideas, different personality types in different rooms and boxes and ideas. And so it's not just that fantasy has a kind of emotional logic to it, or an emotional truth to it that's at the point of the story, but at the point of the kind of very infrastructure or architecture of the tale itself has that same structure.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. And to get back to our example,
sure, yeah,
I think what happens is you've got Diana Wynne-Jones sets up a very complex structure that allows her to explore Sophie's character and that of Howl and several others around her through these kind of externalized, distributed ways. So you actually have, Sophie has two sisters who disguise themselves as each other. And it tells something about them, the fact that they're able to do that or that they want to do that. You've got a character, couple of characters who are barely there or not even there in the film. You've got a Prince Justin who's missing, and you've got a Wizard Solomon who in the film becomes the Solomon, the sort of sinister witch at the heart of the kingdom.
Sure.
So that you have to kind of let go of whatever the book does. But in the book, these two characters, Prince Justin and the Wizard Solomon, have been fractured by the Witch of the Waste. Their personalities are divided up, and a big chunk of both of them is invested in the Scarecrow. So neither is a complete person. So that's yet again that kind of distribution of character that can tell us something, can create a kind of truth. So Miyazaki jettisons all of that, but he keeps the basic sort of architecture of the story and finds it, I think, a congenial form in which to put his own interests of power and obligation and masculinity. And that's why the emphasis shifts from Sophie to Howl.
It's interesting because one of the problems with talking about an adaptation or a literary fantasy versus a cinematic fantasy I always find. I think one of the things that you're saying there speaks very comfortably to cinema, because you're talking about space and you're talking about the cinema is a medium of space. So great. This all seems to apply very nicely. But obviously, one of the things that you're arguing fantasy has the power to do is kind of is to externalize the sort of the subjective experience, and that's historically been a lot. The conventional wisdom is that it's a lot easier to do in a novel because it's a process of narration. So you can anchor a story world very comfortably to a single character in a way you can't do necessarily with a film without using kind of clunky devices like voiceover, and we could have a lovely film philosophical discussion about whether that even does do that job, because it's not the same and all that sort of stuff. Film seems to have an external identity or an objective identity on screen, that whatever objective means, that makes some of this complicated. So I'm just interested. Yeah. So you're arguing, are you arguing that the film kind of takes the same structure and does something very differently with it? But it seems to be what we lose is we go from a character's perspective, Sophie's perspective, to an auteur's perspective, Miyazaki. Is that something that seems to be a thing that cinema does? It still finds its subjectivity, but it's rooted at the artist rather than what is on screen, so to speak. Or is that?
I hadn't thought of it that way, but I was thinking about what sticks in your head after you watch the film. And a lot of it has to do with just the imagery of flight. All of Miyazaki, it is an obsession. The fantastic technologies that are sort of magical, sort of steampunk, the castle itself, but also the strange bomber airplanes that are flying over the city, and even the trains have a little bit of that quality. And just the experience of verticality. A long sequence at the beginning of the movie is Sophie leaving town, but climbing and climbing and climbing. And then many, many scenes of looking down, looking up, vertigo, exhilaration, all of that comes with that experience of verticality. So that's something that a book can't do very well. You can describe, and maybe your audiences, your readers will have enough experience of that kind of thing to be able to visualize and provide their own kind of mental movie. But the film puts it right in front of you. And if those are the things that stick in your head, they must be in some way the things that are of the same kind of centrality as something like a magic spell in the written text. And I might even go further and say that the that experience of looking at a gorgeous hillside or a wind moving the branches of a tree, which is so Miyazaki, is a kind of marker of the hand of the artist, the sketch, the painter, and that is one reason that I think his art of this particular kind of animation is so congenial to fantasy in a way that other kinds of filming never feel quite as completely invested in the fantastic. And I'm kind of basing that on something that I've read in science fiction film criticism by Jay Talat and a few other people. And that is that what we see on the screen in a science fiction film is doubly technological. That is, it's representing a technological future, but it's also representing the technological process that brought us the image. And I think that the hand-drawn look, even though I think some of it was CGI, it still looks hand-drawn in Howl's Moving Castle, and that kind of hand of the artist is the closest thing to this experience that you were talking about of hearing the inner voice of a character or of a narrator.
When you said hand of the artist, Alex smiled at me because he could see my sort of, because I was jotting down lots and lots of things in relation to, firstly, this point about fantasy announcing the process of construction, the sort of kind of architecture, verticality, and also I suppose going back to one of your earlier points about one of the things that Miyazaki does in terms of reconfiguring the focus and making it or moving it away from Sophie's story to Howl's story, which I found interesting to learn, because I would imagine that actually looking at other Ghibli films, Totoro, Kiki's Delivery Service, even Mononoke, that would be unusual. Or I'm sort of surprised to hear that he moved away from Sophie as a character in that sense, because of his and Ghibli's sort of and anime's preoccupation with that kind of shoujo figure of in-betweenness and liminality, not quite a child, not yet an adult. And it would seem that actually Sophie would fit the template of what we might think of as a Ghibli film. But then I realized that actually that liminality is really extended and dramatized, because Sophie's kind of youth and age aren't sort of a function of adolescent activity. They're really stretched out to play across quite dramatic poles of young and old. And so Miyazaki's even playing with his own sort of investment in that shoujo figure, that sort of Japanese young Japanese girl on the cusp of adulthood, and really even playing with that as a trope by anchoring it and stretching it out across these a character that is both young and then super old. But then also that the film, I got really disoriented because the film likes to flip between when she's young and old, and that made me think that it wasn't her point of view. It was it was the film's point of view, but it might be the point of view of the characters, that the story's being moved away from her, and she's often the function of the gaze, and as a result of that, her look changes between young and old. So I found that really striking to learn that Miyazaki changed that element of the book, because I'd have thought keeping it closer to Sophie's story would have been more in line with what I would expect from an anime, quote unquote, of this kind. But I wanted to ask you about Talat. I thought was interesting because Jay Talat writes on animation as well, and there's written a lot about technology in relation to animation, and I wondered then, given what you're saying about that doubling, and what you said about fantasy lending itself almost to that kind of cell animated look, I think within animation, I think there's an ontological identity that we confer onto fantasy. I think cell animation makes a particular kind of film. It's why Disney went back to it in 2009 with The Princess and the Frog. And computer animation doesn't do fairy tales. It can't do fairy tale. And so there is an ontological element, I think, to what animation can and can't do. And it seemed to tap into what you were saying with regards to the way that Ghibli's films look. And it's one of the things that people often write about, that they have preserved their hand-drawnness, despite the fact they're one of the first studios to have a kind of CG domain. They sort of keep it veiled. And so there's a split identity in the films themselves. There are kind of veiled identity that they're perhaps something else. But I was still trying to get my head around the sort of ontological question of why... Of what fantasy looks like in an animated context, and I feel like it doesn't look like the industrial imagery of the digital. It looks like the artisanal, as you were saying, that the kind of hand of the artist cell look that Miyazaki is so famous for.
I think another sort of way of unpacking what's being achieved in this movie cinematically is to think about the subjectivity of kind of perception. I think when we map some of these, and we do it all the time on the podcast, so there's no reason why we should stop now, but when we map sort of terms like, the various rhetorics of fantasy that yourself and scholars like Farah Mendelssohn have explored in relation to literary fantasy onto cinema, they are helpful to quite a large extent in that they can help categorize and subdivide and all this kind of stuff. But of course, it's dubious to call cinematic narration a form of rhetoric, because that would require cinema to be a form of language, and there's a can of worms we could open. So also it implies that kind of one of the thrills of literary fantasy is the ability for the storyteller to invite the reader to sort of use the imagination to visualize. And whatever cinema's doing, it's not really doing that, because the visualization has happened beforehand. So if we talk like, if fantasy is a literature in which subjective identity takes precedence, whether the subjective identity of the reader or of the author or of the characters, where subjectivity is allowed to thrive outside of societal structures of meaning, if cinema can do that too, it has to do it at the level at which we are encouraged to imagine with the image rather than imagine the image into being, right? So those little moments that you mentioned a few minutes ago when we're talking about the moments where you think something is being achieved that is similar to but different from what Diana Wynne-Jones does in the novel, the moments where sort of it feels as though subjectivity is realized in the capture of a moment. Surely what those moments have to achieve is a kind of an imagination that isn't, let's bring this thing into being in my mind, but let's imagine with the world. Let's see the world, to be glib about it, let's see the world differently from a kind of very objective, calculating, the way we're encouraged to see worlds in life. When we go about our day-to-day lives, when we make sure we've got the right way up the street, when we've gone too far in the car and we need to turn around and come back because we've missed our favorite coffee shop, that's a very sensible way of seeing the world. And perhaps what something like Howl's Moving Castle allows us to do is see images differently in a more imaginative state. And that's where subjectivity can thrive, right? In that it's the subjectivity of perception itself that is encouraged rather than a ability to bring images into being in the mind.
Which, if you want to get really sort of theoretical about it.
Let's get really sort of theoretical.
Yeah. I'm game. I'm game.
This does make me think of a couple of things. One is of course, the whole theory of the cinematic gaze and what motivates what the camera is looking at and how we are put into some sort of not our own subjectivity, but an imagined subjectivity of that, which I think reaches its wonderful, absurd limits in a Hitchcock example from Psycho, when you're looking at the room, the motel room where Janet Leigh is walking around, and eventually you realize that the camera is looking at the room from the drawer where the money is hid. So it's the money's eye view that you are getting, and the money's subjectivity, which makes some real interesting sort of choices. I don't know if Miyazaki is deliberately doing anything quite so strange with disorienting us in our sense of identification with the camera, but he does do some really interesting things in a couple of scenes where Sophie basically enters Howl's headspace and actually goes through another kind of portal. Sometimes it's the doorway, but there's also the where she is in the ruins of the house and has to sort of move various obstacles out of the way and comes across a doorway that then eventually doesn't exist anymore. There's an interesting sort of disappearance of the doorway after it's fulfilled its function. But when she goes through that portal, she then is in a space that is partly recognizable as Howl's bedroom, that it has some of the same sort of implements and artifacts around it that we earlier saw in his bedroom, but it's also his past, because we've discovered that she can kind of enter into his past. So we are getting, I guess, Sophie's subjectivity encountering Howl's subjectivity in a visual way. I think those are the most confusing scenes in the movie. I've gone back through those a couple of times and gone, now what's happening here? Who, what, where are we? But I think that they are key to what Miyazaki wants us to see happening with the encounter of these two people that transforms both of them.
Well, I would kind of add to that that sort of instability, or that, as you say, what's going on here? And I think there's something about the kind of film as a whole that really just delights in instability, or a kind of world in flux. And it's not just that the castle is kind of continually changing. And there's a few kind of online little bits and bobs around sort of the use of CGI largely for the castle, which would make perfect sense given it's one of the most sort of agile sculptures, if you like, in the film. But it seems to be that the instability, what I liked about the film is that there was an instability to the fictional world, the animated world, the fantasy world, which maybe spoke to a sort of set of debates around identity and subjectivity, about trying to belong in places and spaces that continually sort of change. And then I was sort of linking that, or thinking about its relationship to flight, and you mentioned kind of that verticality of looking up and scenes from the start, where you have sort of Sophie and Howl. I think in the film there's a bit where they walk on air and they walk over the town. Just put your foot forward and walk, and they do. And there's lots in the film of as you say, looking up and looking down. But a lot of writers on anime have talked about the role of flying and the sky. And there's a book by Patrick Drazen where he talks about the anime skies are crowded, witches are flying on brooms, spaceships are flying from planet to planet, vampires fly in bat shapes through the night sky. The eccentric aircraft designs of Hayao Miyazaki are also up there as well. And of course this links to the shoujo figure I mentioned before, Kiki's Delivery Service, Totoro, the cat bus. There's lots of images of young children flying and looking down, and there's lots to be said by cleverer people than me, but a recent piece that's come out has sort of tried to connect it to kind of fandom, Japanese culture, tropes of androgyny and sort of gender switching, and how flying is part of a world of anime that is about the fluid and about the transformative, that has been sort of picked up, I think. Or there's an article by Deirdre Clyde that talks about androgyny and gender ambiguity are common tropes in Japanese comics and anime, and actually there's a link to be made between those spectators who identify on the LGBTQ spectrum, as she calls it. So kind of interpretations around the fluidity of identity and anime in particular, which seem particularly rooted in images of flight and flying, and as Clyde says, androgyny and gender. There seems to be a nice little link between I don't want to say it's sort of Sophie's coming of age, given what you say about the movement away in the film from her point of view or subjectivity to Howl's. But actually, Howl himself is presented as sort of a teen in places, as well as assuming many other forms. But I found that really interesting, the untetheredness of the whole film, things that can just be picked up and moved, whether it's a flame, which we could talk a lot about Billy Crystal, but we probably don't have time. But just I liked that this was a world constantly in flux, and I think I would be interested to read a sort of queer reading of a film that unfolds along that line that really speaks to animation's role in feeding the fantasy of worlds that are in flux and identities that are being formed, reformed, or yet to form, essentially.
That makes me think about the very beginning of the film, in which Sophie is presented as much younger than she is in the book.
Right.
She's not that kind of adolescent figure. She's past that.
It's about 18, isn't she, in the book? Is that right? Or?
Yeah. Well, she's the oldest of three, and they're all of marriageable age. So exactly where that fits is a little bit dodgy. But in the film, we have an encounter between her and the soldiers, and they are exaggeratedly different in scale. She's tiny, they're huge. And Howl, when he first appears, is close in size to the soldiers and much more in the sort of conventionally masculine appearance that is intimidating from this kind of almost juvenile feminine perspective. And clearly she's not sure if he's going to be the same as the soldiers. What changes is then that he takes her up into the air and shows her how to walk on air. And he says, "You're a natural at this," which I took, because I am a fan of Sophie in the book, to be one of the signs that she might have her own powers.
Right.
But it never makes that explicit in the film. But it certainly changes the dynamic between the two of them. And from that point on, he is progressively represented as less and less large, imposing, and masculine, and much more sort of gender fluid. As his hair changes color, as his clothing changes, the scale changes so that they're close to the same size. And they both, he looks younger as the movie goes on. Now, the other thing that happens to Howl is his transformation as he's trying to defend against the military attacks, against the bombardment, and particularly as he's trying to defend Sophie and her household. He takes on this avian sort of appearance. He's sort of like half bird, half man. That's completely not in the book, but you can see it in some of the other Miyazaki films. But I also am wondering whether, because I know Miyazaki was aware of A Wizard of Earthsea and Le Guin, that's a key moment in Wizard of Earthsea, is when Ged the wizard has transformed into his hawk form and stays in it too long and is almost unable to change back. And it takes his mentor figure to help him find himself as a human again. So that may be where Miyazaki pulled that from to put into Howl's story. It works well for what's happening to him. And it suggests something about that bird form is the kind of military obligation, the patriotic obligation that he tries to evade but can't, and eventually accepts, and it almost kills him. Either literally killing him or killing the human within him when he can't change back and seems to be not even conscious anymore. So that's the flip side. The androgynous Howl that Sophie forms a kind of bond with is the positive image. The military hawk-like self is the danger. But he can't not be that, because that's part of who he is as well.
Yeah. That's really interesting. The sort of debates, and kind of going back to Clyde's work, based on what you said, that sort of question of gender fluidity is often signified as a sort of quest for authenticity, or the to be your own radical subversive self potentially, and purity. And so debates around gender fluidity, certainly within in the context of this film, might, I don't know, there's something to be said around what the film is saying about authenticity. I think there's a line, I think it's a line spoken by Billy Crystal as the flame, calcifer. There's something like, people need to be careful when it comes to transforming, because they'll forget how to turn back, or something. I'm butchering it, but something along those lines. And I don't know, there seem to be some potential within the dreamlike fairy tale world of this film, where everything seems to be relatively sort of, I don't know, polymorphous or fluid. These are all words that I think are used to describe kind of gender as this malleable and interpretive set of signifiers. But yeah, I thought one of the strongest elements of the film was that kind of metamorphic, polymorphous quality. I'm not going to use the word plasmatic, because we talk on this podcast a lot about kind of plasmaticness, but there was a sort of sense of, there was that going on at the same time as this kind of anti-war rhetoric. And I liked the way that the film played out, almost like it plays out a lot of Miyazaki's films in the pull between modernity and tradition, or between nature and culture, or nature and technology. They all almost play out like kind of genre hybrids. There's sort of two things going on all the time, and I really like that push-pull relationship that often manifests in
Ghibli films. Alex, you're about to say something.
I'm just glad. I'm glad you sort of teed my question up nicely there, Chris, because I was interested in how these ideas, how these sort of imaginative moments, these capacities for metamorphosis, there's capacities for change, for flight, both literally and metaphorically, tie in with that anti-war message. Because if that's the big sort of Miyazaki contribution to this mythology, is adding that and explicitly. And I was interested to read in research to this episode that's been widely read, and actually Miyazaki's given interviews about how this was kind of very much inspired by the Iraq War and his opposition towards it. So there was obviously a very sort of explicit and overt political intent by Miyazaki in making this movie. So I wonder, Brian, if you had any thoughts on how that aspect of the film marries up with any of those things, or perhaps they don't marry up, and that would be interesting to talk about as well.
That's one of the things I've wondered about, and again, I don't want to say here's what the book did, which is the real story, and here's what the adaptation does. But I do think that what Miyazaki found in the characters and the setup was, it turns out to be a kind of appropriate vehicle. Is that too loaded a term here? For his emotional response and his kind of covert political statements about war, about aggression. Interestingly, he has not the king, but the king's wizard, whom he makes feminine, be the instigator of this war. It's all her doing. And she's the one who says, okay, we're done with it now at the end. And that's it. There's no sense of who the enemy is. It's an internal enemy. It's an artificially constructed war, which again might be a fairly subtle reference to what happened in the Iraq invasion.
Yeah.
There's another side to Howl that is in the book that I think maybe allows for this, and that's a kind of insecurity and vanity in Howl. And one of the great sequences in the movie is right out of the book, which is a tantrum where he is in despair, partly because he can't dye his hair the color he wants it to be.
Yeah, I happened to notice he dyed it red, and that was what caused it despair. And it says the redhead in the podcast, so I was offended, of course.
I think in the book he's actually redheaded and he dyes it black.
Right.
If I remember right.
See, the books are always better than the films.
Yeah. But at any rate, that's even more played up in the book. He's very vain about his clothing and uses his clothing to sort of captivate young women. And Sophie gets mad at that and cuts up one of his suits and then has to sew it back together. And to have his tantrum sort of manifest physically through the entire house. Again, that is in the book, but Miyazaki makes a wonderful sort of set piece with his usual kind of slug-like imagery of the slime that's coming off of Howl. That sense that your inner life can be expressed in very physical ways that will impinge upon the space and the other characters. This gives Miyazaki room to do things that the book doesn't do, but that are, I guess, structurally, as I said at the beginning, structurally compatible with what the book does.
Yeah. I really like that notion of the kind of the almost psychospatial fantasy structure. And I think when filmmakers kind of talk about being true to the essence of the novel and we've changed things, but we've changed them to speak to the that's kind of really woolly language that the more you think about it, the less you understand what it means. Maybe what partially they're getting at is this idea that the book gives you a kind of a structure by which you can then inhabit emotionally, and then you as a filmmaker have this presumed right or the ability or the desire to take that structure and alter it. So I love that idea that Miyazaki found in this novel that isn't about the same political context he's interested in, a way of dealing or engaging artistically with that emotionally. And it's about transplanting almost like a tool, one to another. It's a really rich way of understanding what we're talking about here. And I think the film does resonate with those things. I was struck by the line he said, I see no point in living if it can't be beautiful. That's certainly the English translation. How it's exactly articulated in Japanese, I don't know. And it seems to be that focus on beauty is also a focus on fixed identity. It's a focus on external identity, and it's very oppositional to all the things we've been talking about that are the kind of liberating aspects of this movie. So in that way, I guess there is a set of values in place here that does speak to his political concerns.
And just to follow up on that, Sophie says, "I was never beautiful." Right after that. And the film does not try to make her beautiful in the conventional sort of anime way. She's certainly attractive, young, healthy, pleasing, but not beautiful. And the character who is, she asks how he ever got involved with the Witch of the Waste. He says she used to be beautiful. Mm-hmm. And there are sort of remnants of that beauty when we first see her, even though she's gotten sort of older and fatter. And then that just completely disintegrates by midway through the film.
So is there any tension in that critique of beauty and the kind of Miyazaki's penchant for the grotesque or the abject? Because that there is a certain element of that character in particular, the Witch of the Waste, has a certain abject, grotesqueness to them, and the slime and this is another feature of Miyazaki. I think the food always looks delicious, but there's always going to be a scene that grosses you out, which is usually the kind of you know. So is there any contradiction in that? Because the film seems to, on one hand, be rejecting that notion of physical beauty, but also maybe not affirming it, but certainly affirming it through these moments of abject, you know, figures of you know, fatness, figures of you know, substances and puke and no one does a melting character quite like Miyazaki, you know, characters that sort of melt into no form whatsoever. I don't know. It struck me as you said that there does seem to be a certain difference between those two things.
There's also a connection to appetite.
Right.
And the witch in the film, even when she has become a much more benign figure than she starts out, she still hungers for Howl's heart, which is calcifer's heart. And I think there's a play on that works in English and not in Japanese, so I don't know how that happened, but heart and hearth is deliberately played on in the English language script. And we have not talked about Calcifer and the bargain that Howl made to give his heart to this fallen star so that it can remain alive. That's a big part of the book. It's sort of still there in the movie, but in a kind of confusing way. But that is who Calcifer is. So in a sense, he and Howl have exchanged identities or merged identities, and that's why the house is also, again, structurally himself. It manifests the way he feels by the shape it takes. Even though Calcifer, script-wise, is the ironic commentator on Howl and his vanity and his sort of peevishness and so on, they're still the same person in a way.
Yeah. Is that a case with the book? Is that Calcifer? Is he that kind of wry, ironic presence that he seems to operate in?
He is, but he's more separate from Howl. And he should never have been voiced by Billy Crystal.
It feels very kind of, you know, animated sidekick. There are many films I'm discovering at the more podcasts we do that would benefit from the removal of a whimsical animated sidekick. I feel like we've both talked about everything there's possible to talk about in the movie and yet haven't started yet. But I think we've certainly done justice to some of the complicated structures of reality that you alluded to at the front there, Brian. I think it's a really, like all Miyazaki's work, it's a brain scrabble to work out how to kind of attach yourself to it. And I always love doing podcasts on them because they help me articulate my response to them. And so thanks, Brian. I think before we will let you go, could you just tell us a little bit more? We've alluded to your new work and some of the ideas within it in this discussion. And you've got one buyer already because I'm absolutely fascinated by what you've got to say. But in an attempt to maybe get a couple more, could you just give us a sort of a little sort of discussion about what the book's about and what you're hoping to achieve in it?
The origin of the book was a series of talks I gave a couple of years ago when I was in residence in Glasgow in their fantasy program. And part of my duty was to give a set of public talks. And so it made me think about, these are the things I've been interested in. Why am I interested in them? And they boiled down to thinking about fantasy in terms of how can something so apparently meaningless be meaningful? So how does it mean? And I stole that phrase from John Ciardi, the poet critic, who wrote a book called How Does a Poem Mean? Not what does it mean, but how. And then second, what does it do? What kind of cultural work is the term I got from a scholar named James Tompkins, the cultural work it performs in the world. So it doesn't just sit there and look pretty. It makes you think, it makes you act, it alters the world around it if it is functioning fully. So I did this series of talks, and they became chapters in this book, but they all take different approaches. So like one is about how some elements of fantasy might enter into kind of realism. Another is about how writers take older texts and incorporate them into their contemporary work, and how that adds to meaning. So lots of different approaches. One chapter entirely on fantasy and fear, because I got really fascinated by that. But as I was thinking about each of these talks, they all came down to some version of how does it mean? What does it do? So that's what the book turned into. And that is going to be coming out from Oxford University Press in, I believe, May.
Well, you've done it again, Brian. In about 2 sentences, you've managed to articulate thoughts that would take me decades down into a few nicely clear paragraphs, and it's a rare talent to do, and I'm amazed, but I'm really excited to read it. It sounds great. And God, yeah, some work I'm doing at the moment on fear, that chapter is really going to be helpful for that for me. So I encourage listeners to get it. It'll probably be out by the time you're listening to it, or shortly soon thereafter. For now, Brian, I mean, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure to meet you face to face. Your work will continue to be cited on the on the show. And thanks for sharing your thoughts on Howl's Moving Castle.
Well, thank you for inviting me. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, absolutely it was. The pleasure was all ours.
Yeah.
Facebook, Instagram, at Fananim Research, FANANIM Research. Take part in the conversations there. Let us know what you think about what we said today, good or bad. We'd love to hear from you. And of course, there's our now new, brand spanking new footnote episodes that come in between these larger episodes. If there's a term, an idea, a concept, a name that we've dropped in the last kind of hour or so that you are completely baffled by, send us an email, fananimresearch, FANANIM research @gmail.com, and we will give you 10 minutes of our time to make it make sense. Consider it our office hours, and they are open for business. Otherwise, that's been us for another episode, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.